Hello, this is John Robles. I'm speaking with Mr. Len Bracken. He's the author of 6 books, including The Shadow Government 9/11 and State Terror. He's also a specialist in international affairs and international relations and an accredited journalist. Hello, sir.
How do you do? Thank you for having me.
And thanks for agreeing to speak with us. It's a pleasure. My first question regarding the motivations for your book, The Shadow Government 9/11 and State Terror. Can you give us a little bit of a background, why you wrote it, what led you to write it?
Well, when 9/11 happened, I was in Riga, Latvia for an activist event to sort of protest consumerism that took place throughout the entire city. And the day of the event, I knew better than to jump to any conclusions. And I was very reluctant, of course, to say one way or the other, who had done it. But after about 6 months' time and looking at some of the evidence, and of course, this is the same year that James Bamford published Body of Secrets that contained the information and the reproductions of the documents about Operation Northwoods. For your listeners, who may not know, Operation Northwoods was proposed in the early 60s prior to the Vietnam, the beginning of the Vietnam War and Gulf of Tonkin. Just before that.
That was the one, I'm sorry, that was the one to blow up a drone civilian aircraft and start a war with Cuba, right?
Exactly right, yes.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about that plan. It was actually turned down for the extreme quality of it, but...
Yeah, sure. It was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lyman Lemnitzer, who proposed the plan to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. And so the idea was to, have a covert attack upon Americans. So the idea that they would attack America and this would provide justification for a U.S. military intervention in Cuba. So I guess that they had planned some bombings in Miami and Washington, D.C., and the blowing up an American ship in Cuban waters. So that was just sort of what the plan had as far as its stratagems, these kind of tactics that it would use to provoke an attack. I have a theory that I've developed. It's not just my theory, but I've advanced it somewhat, and we call this a indirect attack. So this is always an attack pretending to be someone else. So the idea was that the attack would be staged. It would make it look like the Cubans had done it, and that would justify the attack. And we can see throughout history that this has taken place. You had Cuba, in fact. You have the sinking of the USS Maine in 1898. To get the United States into the Spanish-American War, and then in 1915 you have the sinking of Lusitania to bring the United States into World War I. 1939, you have the provocation by Hitler. He staged the raid on the Gleitzwitz radio station to begin war with Poland. And of course you have Pearl Harbor in 1941, and Operation Northwoods was 1962, and then 1964 was the Gulf of Tonkin. So at the same time that the assassinations, and of course we're coming up on the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, these events that are more well known and sort of more accepted as having involvement of the state and statesmen, these other things were also taking place, and of course these two now are becoming increasingly more accepted.
You just mentioned Pearl Harbor as being a false flag attack. Can you give us a little background on why you're saying that was a false flag?
You can look at some of the books that have come out. The one that I draw on a great deal is called Others Unknown. It's by Stephen Jones. And so, I think that the evidence has come out that there was advanced knowledge on the part of the U.S. military and U.S. administration at the time, administration of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the idea was that they would send out the newer ships so that the older ships would be blown up and that it would look like the Japanese had, in fact, attacked us without our knowledge, when, in fact, there was advanced knowledge, and the people on the ground in Hawaii were denied the information that was being held in Washington. There are some documents that were missing from the archives that points to this. It's the implication that one of the things about the book, which is, Shadow Government 9/11 and State Terror, in addition to some detailed synopsis of these events, we also have a chronology.
I recently wrote an article regarding 9/11, etc., and I found a mention of your book. I was researching actually something that I had read years ago from the Project for a New American Century. It was very interesting that when I started researching this, the Project for a New American Century website was up, and within like 5 hours of my beginning digging there, the site went down and disappeared and has not come back up. Regarding 9/11 state terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism, and in particular the Project for a New American Century. Can you give us a background?
Yeah, sure. So I'm also the author of the first biography in any language on the French theoretician and filmmaker named Guy Debord, they say in French. And he was a part of what was called the Situations International. You know, it's a radical Marxist group that went from 1956 into the early 70s. And he stayed together with one of the members of the group who's named Gianfranco Sanguinetti. And the two of them developed a theory of terrorism. It's sort of an offensive, defensive theory of terrorism, saying there's offensive terrorism, there's defensive terrorism. It can be either direct or indirect. And I've been working with that theory, trying to develop it, try to advance it, because, you know, as I say, I wrote the biography on Debord, and I also translated a book by Sanguinetti. Sanguinetti's book is called On Terrorism in the State, and this is where this theory was presented for the first time. So with my book, what we set out to do initially was to prove what we call the state terror thesis. And this is to recount many of the instances in which it's well known or fairly well known, and there's some reasonable evidence to support the idea that states use terror. A big thing that influenced me in writing the book was the fact that in 2001, Jim Bamford published a body of secrets about the NSA and other things, which talked about Operation Northwoods. A more recent example was actually spoken of by Zbigniew Brzezinski in a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing in February 2007, in which he referenced a leaked document that said that George W. Bush had considered shooting down a UN plane in order to justify attacking Iraq. So there's a lot of instances of this. With regard to Sanguinetti and his theory on terrorism in the state, this involved the assassination in May of 1978 of Aldo Moro, who was the Christian Democratic Party leader who was trying to reconcile some of the different political factions in his country. And, of course, Sanguinetti's book was published in the next year, in 1979, and then again in 1980 they had the Bologna railway bombing, which killed a lot of people. And, a lot of the evidence has pointed back to, I hate to say this, but it's pointed back to NATO and this Operation Gladio, it's called. And there are several books published in Europe that have gone into great detail. One is by Philip Willen. It's called Puppet Masters, The Political Use of Terrorism in Italy. Another one's called NATO's Secret Armies by Daniel Ganser. Of course, there's books in French and Italian on the subject. And in fact, the European Parliament has tried to go back to NATO and say, what is the chain of command on this? How could you have justified these attacks, staging these attacks, pretending to be the Red Brigades in Italy, and yet, having infiltrated these groups? And NATO refused to respond.
What was the purpose of Gladio?
Well, the original idea behind Gladio was that these were going to be stay-behind armies. So after World War II, the United States and NATO would leave caches of weapons in countries such as Greece and Italy and Turkey and set up networks that could be used in the event of a Soviet invasion or a Soviet takeover or a Communist Party takeover and then an invitation of the Soviets, any eventuality. That was the purported idea behind these stay-behind armies. But in the end, they ended up being engaged in provocations, and according to Philip Willen, a lot of it goes back to the CIA base in Paris, the Hyperion Language School, and that a lot of the people who were the Red Brigades who were doing the liaison, the sort of fake Red Brigades, these that infiltrate, that they were doing the liaison with the CIA at the Hyperion Language School in Paris at the time. In any case, that's sort of briefly, and it turns out the man who is most suspected of having pulled the trigger on Aldo Moro is free at this time. He did some prison time, but he's actually a free man right now.
I see. Back to your book, The Shadow Government, 9/11, and State Terror. What were the motivations behind your book?
Well, people knew about my work in developing a chronology for the strategy of tension. This is called the strategy of tension in Italy. So the idea would be that they would create so much social tension that the masses would want to have the state protect them, and it would justify any kind of police actions. It would justify a crackdown on the left, for example. So I'd done a lot of work on that. I developed a chronology of the Situations International in Italy and of the strategy of tension in Italy. It's in my book called The Arch Conspirator. It's a collection of essays. And in fact, I associated that with an open letter to the citizens of Poland in which I warned them that if they were to join NATO, that they would potentially have some negative repercussions along these lines. Of course, it turned out to be different. They were used more as these kind of rendition centers, if my understanding of that is correct.
The black sites.
Right, exactly. So The idea is that you could have direct defensive terrorism. So this goes back to the terror of the French Revolution, so that the terror was used by the revolutionary regime to defend itself. And it was done so directly. They said, okay, we're going to go out, we're going to scorched earth policy, and we're going to just terrorize everyone, and they will fall in line with our revolutionary dictates. So that would be a direct defensive attack, right? And then you have a direct offensive attack. Mm-hmm. So these categories are a little bit muddy. The example used by Sanguinetti would be the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. But of course we know that there were probably infiltrators there, and that this is not so clean. But just this whole idea that you could have the IRA, the PLO, these groups would be involved in direct offensive attacks against the established power, right? So it's a mm-hmm. minor group against the state. So then you come to the category of the indirect defensive attack, and this is the example that we could use from Italy, where the Red Brigades are infiltrated, they're militarized, and a defensive attack is staged, but it's done indirectly in order to justify the established power going on the offensive, or for other reasons. So basically it allows a draconian crackdown. It allows the Patriot Act, for example, in the case of the United States. And then there's the fourth category, which is the indirect offensive attack, which has not been developed by Sanguinetti, and I've done some unpublished work in that area. But consider maybe, for example, the British were caught in Iraq dressed as Muslims and carrying bombs and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So this would be an indirect offensive attack. They're pretending to be someone else, but they're doing it in a foreign country in an offensive attack.
There were reports out of Libya when all that was going on. There's been reports out of Syria as well, of officers being caught with British accents and Turkish accents and foreign languages being spoken.
It could very well be that this fourth category, this indirect offensive attack, is where everything has gone since the 9/11, which was an indirect defensive attack, although it was never really purely an indirect defensive attack because you probably had Israeli and Saudi involvement as well. And so it wasn't just the United States. There was also other regimes.
Recently, Prince Bandar, or Bandar Bush, as he's commonly called, threatened President Putin and the Russian Federation with terrorist attacks during the Olympic Games if Russia did not pull its support for Syria. He also admitted that they control Chechen terrorist groups. They control Al-Qaeda in Syria. What can you tell us about that? The Saudi connection to Syria, to 9/11, to the Bush family, et cetera, if you could.
With regard to 9/11, I can say that there was the report of the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the U.S. House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. This is the joint inquiry into intelligence community activities before and after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. So this was released in December 2002. And quite often when you get a report like this that's conducted sort of right after the fact, it's going to be much more accurate than the 9/11 Commission report, which we understand it was more novelistic than historical. So with regard to the Senate report, there are missing, I believe, 24, 28 pages, and our understanding is that Senator Robert Graham has indicated in his novels and in other places, he's sort of implied that these missing pages relate to Saudi involvement in 9/11. Of course, there was a plane that ushered out when all other flights were halted. The Saudis were escorted out of the country. We understand that there was also a plane, maybe even before the Saudi plane, that ushered out Israeli nationals.
And the bin Laden family.
But the most damning evidence, in my opinion, goes to the Israelis because, I've made the trip to Weehawken, New Jersey, where they had urban moving systems, and the only people arrested on the day of 9/11 were Israeli citizens, some of them tied to Mossad. We know that with regard to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, that the safe house in New Jersey at the time was run by a Mossad agent, probably working with the United States. In 2001, urban moving systems, they had the white vans. The vans, Dan Rather said, hey, police have stopped a white van on the George Washington Bridge, and it has thousands of pounds of explosives. And, of course, the people were arrested. There was a massive spy dragnet, but they were all allowed to go back to Israel. And our understanding is that the person who was running the operation in Weehawken at Urban Moving Systems is back in the United States and is actually living here now. What the law enforcement officials that we spoke to when we went back to Weehawken years after the attack, they said that they were livid because they knew what was in there. There were bombs, there were detonators, and there was even supposedly anthrax there, is what they told us.
This is John Robles. You were listening to an interview with Len Bracken. He's the author of several novels, including The Shadow Government, 9/11, and State Terror. That was part one of an interview in progress. You can find the rest of this interview on our website,